Hello, everybody. This is Tosca at NGO Soul and Strategy. And today we're having a very special episode. We're going to talk with somebody who I deeply respect, Chris Proulx at Humentum. He's going to talk with us about the broader theme of how to rest, how to reset as a leader in our sector, and how to find and refine resilience. And I'll explain in a moment why we came up with this term. So Chris has been a colleague and a friend for a while now, and I value his insight on management and leadership in our sector a lot. I also value his insights on innovation and what it means to be entrepreneurial, and I've learned a lot from him. I value his all-around thoughtfulness, ethics, and his values. And Chris and I happen to share an interest in meditation and leadership, although he has a lot more depth in that than I do. So it was immediately clear to me that when Chris announced that he was going to take 4 months off in the second half of last year, 2021, for a sabbatical, and that when he indicated in public that he sensed he was suffering from some symptoms of burnout, that I would want to interview him. And of course, we are going to respect his personal privacy in this interview. So I'm aiming to ask questions that are of generalizable interest to the sector and valuable to the sector. So with that, Chris, let me welcome you.
Great. It's great to be here. And I think this is such an important conversation to be having, and looking forward to see where it goes.
Yeah, totally. So Chris, for our listeners who doesn't know him, so he's the global director for what is now called Solutions at Humentum. And I will be asking you, Chris, in a moment, of course, to explain what Humentum is. He was the president and CEO of LINGOs, which was one of the 3 parts of Humentum that integrated through a merger. What is it now? 3, 4, 5 years ago?
Almost 5, yeah.
Almost 5. Incredible, right?
Yes.
And LINGOs was, and Humentum still offers e-learning solutions and other forms of learning solutions for the NGO, not just the INGO, but also the national NGO sector. And before that, he was the CEO of Cornell University's eCornell here in the United States. And that was and is presumably an online education company connected to that university. And interestingly enough, and I think valuable enough, he has held positions also at an internet design consulting company, as well as in the retail industry, so in the private sector. So Chris, with that bio, then let's start. For the record, can you tell us at the very beginning of this interview what your sabbatical entailed practically? Why did it happen in kind of, if you could talk about in an introductory fashion first, and where are you now?
Sure. So as you noted, I took 4 months leave from September through December of last year. And quite simply, it was basically about rest. I know a number of people, when they're doing sabbaticals, take really monumental trips or invest a lot of time in learning some new things. And I went in quite with the intention to primarily keep it simple, to rest, and found, and I'm sure we'll talk about this as we keep going, that even my unambitious plans were more ambitious than I expected. So it mostly entailed spending a lot of time outdoors. I live in a great place. It was in a great time of year to be able to do that. So hiking and running, etc. A lot of work in my garden. It entailed reading several books and doing a little bit of kind of musing and writing about those books. And we can sort of talk about that. A couple of short trips, but nothing monumental. And then just, supporting my household and my family and spending time doing that. So that's basically what it entailed. I am back at work now here at Humentum as Global Director of Solutions. And let me just say a couple words about the why. The why, I mean, you gave a nice little short summary of my bio there. I mean, for about 20 years, have either been in a startup situation, a merger situation, a turnaround situation, and didn't even allow really sort of transitions between those opportunities. So often was going from one to the next, or in some cases doing 2 things even at once. And I think I did not pay attention to how those kinds of activities really tax the mind, they tax the body, they tax the spirit. And maybe we'll have a little time to talk about time actually in this conversation. We'll see whether I can squeeze that in and what that means in terms of how we measure performance and results and accomplishments over different periods of time. And I think it all started to kind of blend together for me, honestly. And I got to a certain point where I realized I was losing the perspective I needed to be an effective leader.
Losing the perspective. Why don't you talk about time since you brought it up? Let's go there.
Yeah. So, look, we all know that feels like the world is speeding up, right? We all know that because of the sort of constant that there's this sense that you're needed all the time. And that is all true, right? But I don't think that's the root of the problem, right? I think the root of the problem is we've lost track of the fact that time is, of course, time is a bit of a perception or an illusion, some people even say, right? And what that really means is that we actually have the ability to stretch things out or shorten things down, right? Or to determine for ourselves what is the right rhythm, cadence, pace that something needs to happen in our lives. And I think certainly for me, I started to kind of feel like everything needed to happen faster. It needed to happen within the same short-term window. And I very much sort of lost sight of like, well, what's being accomplished in a year or 5 years or 10 years? And if you take that to a leadership point of view, and I haven't fully thought this thing through, right? But I think there's lots of space for organizations and for leaders to think about the fact that different milestones in the organization's journey are happening at different paces and aligning, therefore, effort, people, metrics to those kinds of things, right? So yes, there are things that you might need to measure literally on a daily basis. So know what those are that you want to measure on a daily basis. And then recognize that there are other things that maybe the right interval is a year or 5 years, right? And I think prior to like at least the 20th century, I think humans had a much more flexible idea of what time was and what was the right interval to sort of, interact with, and we all know that, different cultures aligned with seasonal changes or lunar changes or whatever. And I think that's a broader way of thinking about the fact that there are multiple ticks of the clock, essentially, and we've kind of very much landed on one, and I think that's problematic.
Wow, that's a really strong entry to this interview. And I'm thinking about the 7 generations time perspective, right?
Right.
And I'm thinking about a podcast that I really like, that is the Long Time Academy, is put out by Headspace.
Yeah.
I will put it in the show notes, and it's a terrific perspective also on time. Coming back to the overall purpose of your sabbatical. So if I just give it a shorthand, and please tell me if it's something different, but rest, reset, and resilience, right? What did you, broadly speaking, learn about that in the retreat, in your sabbatical?
So first I learned something interesting about rest, and I experienced this. And when I talked to others who had taken a similar kind of break, either as a sabbatical or as a big gap between two different parts of their career, the assumption is that you're exhausted, and on day one, you will just sleep. And what's interesting is that my mind wasn't ready to do that. And I found in talking to others that their minds weren't ready to do that either. Is that to be able to properly rest actually requires, it turns out, a little space and a little prep. And so the first few days and weeks were more active, more busy for me. Now, partly that's just the habit, right, of trying to kind of keep things going when we're all used to being overachievers.
Exactly. Yeah.
But part of it also, I think, is even though even in areas where I couldn't pull that habit back, like my mind and my body weren't ready to sleep extended periods of time, take naps, etc. And in fact, really what happened for me is I had about 2/3 of the way through the retreat, I did a sabbatical. I did a 3 weeks meditation retreat. When I came back from that, then suddenly I was overwhelmed with exhaustion. And you would say,
Hmm.
well, you just had 3 weeks of doing nothing. And I did, in theory, have 3 weeks of doing nothing. But I think finally I was able to let go of a lot of the things that my mind had been holding on to. And then it was like, okay, now I need to rest. And this was like with only 3 weeks of the sabbatical left to go. And I'm like, how am I going to go back to work? I'm exhausted. But I didn't need that much time. Like by the last week of December, I was waking up again naturally at my normal time. I was energized when I kind of came back to work. So I think the first thing is what we think we understand about rest is not always exactly what we need to understand about rest, right? For reset, I've quite intentionally, literally, I didn't talk to anyone from my organization, really. I, for the most part, turned off LinkedIn. I would look at it, maybe once a week. So I very intentionally shifted my mind and attention to other things and didn't want to necessarily have this be a big learning time. Like I really wanted to reset. And then I paid attention to what bubbled up. Where did I find interests, right? And so I found myself gravitating to being interested in reading about the mind and neuroscience and what people are learning about that and consciousness and what it means for leadership. And I just followed that. I just followed that thread. And it led me from one area, one book to one podcast to another podcast, et cetera. For different people, it's going to be different things, right? But I think that part of reset is that, yes, it's the rest is important, but having your mind be actively engaged on something that is of interest is in itself a different kind of rest. And it's part of that reset, right? It's like,
Yes.
oh, this is stuff that maybe I was interested in before, I just couldn't get to it, right?
Yes.
And so now with a little space, that kind of use of our body and mind can be relaxing, actually.
Yes.
So
Yes.
I see that as part of the reset.
Right, can be rejuvenating, and it's also something that you potentially can use, can apply in
Right.
your work situation afterwards, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Anything that comes up about resilience, or should we move to another question?
I think resilience is really, in some ways, more about thinking about, okay, so what's going to be different? And I think you might want to dig into that with another question. So I don't know if you want me to go there now or not.
Why don't you?
I think what I learned about resilience, let me sort of frame my thought here just a little bit. I think one thing I learned about resilience is that I was not relying on the help and support of others as nearly as much as I could have. And part of that is habitual for me, probably. Part of that is cultural. Plenty is written about the sort of individualistic sense of the West, right?
Yeah.
And so, yeah, so part of it has definitely been reflecting a lot on what that means for me and how I can create more support structures or just use the support structures are there. I think I had a great team that was willing to support me. I don't think I was taking advantage of it as much as I could. I think keeping in mind kindness and kindness to myself and kindness to others for just the reality of the fact that most of this stuff we're actually not as much control of as we want to anyway, right? A new client is going to call tomorrow that we haven't even thought about today and might have a really interesting piece of work, and it's not in the plan, or something happens in your family that's not in the plan. A pandemic wasn't in the plan. I mean, this is all of this stuff in the last 2.5 years has taught all of us so much about that we cannot control almost all of it. And so somehow building a comforting personal relationship to that and that lack of control, and then trying to bring more kindness to ourselves and to others. And I said to my daughter the other day, I said, oh, I'm learning a little bit the difference between being nice and kindness. There was silence for a minute. And then she's like, well, what is the difference? And the way I define the difference is being nice is an obligation. It's like, I'm going to be nice to you, Tosca, because I want you to like me, or
Right.
I was culturally trained to just, the golden rule or whatever. Whereas
Yes.
kindness is really sort of thinking about like, what's really going on here, right? Oh, we're doing this podcast right now. You probably have a million other things going on. I had other things going on. It's a more spacious space, or more spacious awareness around what everyone is working through, and applying that to yourself.
I like
And
that, a more space and a greater awareness of spaciousness, and therefore what one could inquire into, if you will.
yeah,
Yeah, interesting. Gosh, there's so much more that we could go deeper, but I want to make sure that our audience walks away with a couple of other things as well. So one thing that came up, and I don't know, Chris, whether it came up in our meditation leadership circle or whether it came up somewhere else, but the art of doing nothing. Something that I, Tosca, utterly fail in, generally speaking. So during your sabbatical, Chris, did you do nothing sometimes?
yes, but I had to learn the art of doing nothing. Um, I was I was a little anxious, honestly, about having too much empty space,
Yeah.
and how that would affect my mood, my mental health, um, my energy level, would I ever want to go back to work? I mean, there were plenty of anxieties about having all of that space. And so, I mean, it's no joke. I'm embarrassed to admit this. I sat down, literally in that first week, and I was scheduling the day.
Yeah.
And what it was included in
I
that day were
imagine.
things that were restful. I mean, it was like, oh, I'm going to hike from this period of time, and I'm going to clean the kitchen at this time, and I'm going to meditate at that time. And really, I was about like, I don't know, maybe 2 weeks in, I was like, this is just ridiculous, because what was happening is, back to control, is things would happen and suddenly the day was off kilter. And I
Mhm.
was anxious about that. So that's when I did a couple of things. I first looked at my list of things that I might want to do or accomplish on this sabbatical, and I just started crossing things off. And that is I'll come back to why I did that. So, because there's another core point about that. So that was one thing I did. And then I largely threw the schedule away, and allowed things to take a little bit more of the space and time that they needed to take. So it wasn't always doing nothing, but sometimes it was doing something without as much of an agenda to finish by a certain time or whatever. And then I did this 3-week meditation retreat, which
Mhm.
is arguably 3 weeks of doing nothing, depending on how you want to look at it. But even there, so the structure of this retreat is very structured. You wake up at a certain time, you eat, you do a sitting meditation, you do a walking meditation, that kind of unfolds for 14 hours, you go to bed, right? And I noticed when there was somewhat open time on the schedule, that something wasn't quite scheduled, or I finished something a little bit early, there was that little anxious voice was still there, even on that retreat. And so I remember having a conversation with one of the teachers about, okay, my goal now, and this is about halfway through, my goal for the next 10 days is to truly find, like, how effortless can this be? How much can I withdraw effort, and still kind of maintain enough structure and rigor to maintain the retreat? And she said, oh, that's really interesting. That's really interesting. You should find out what you learn about that. And my lesson is that I think I got to the end of the 3 weeks and I didn't find the bottom of that. Is that I was still space to unwind, still space to find less efforting, still space to find less kind of pushing into, like, trying to make an experience happen the way it is. And, so if I was doing that there when I was truly like permission to do nothing, I mean, that means that that habit is with me when I'm at work, and it's, with me when I'm going through my day to day.
Yeah,
And I'm sure I am not alone in carrying that habit around.
of course
And
not.
I think that's something for all of us to practice with, is to say, all right, where am I doing that? And how can I just back off on that just a little bit?
Yeah, yeah. So, um, what have you learned from this sabbatical about yourself that you're comfortable in sharing, that you think is generalizable to a broader set of NGO leaders?
probably the biggest thing I've talked to people about since coming back is the preciousness of our attention and how poorly we use it individually and collectively. And there's plenty of stuff written. We could have a whole podcast series about distraction, right? And one of the books I read on the retreat is this book, on the sabbatical, is this book, Indistractable by Nir Eyal. It's great. If you're at all worried about your level of distraction, I highly recommend Nir Eyal's book. And that's part of it, right? So part of it is am I going to be distracted by the phone dinging something at me, which I won't right now because you told me to turn it off. That's one level of attention, right? But what I discovered on the sabbatical as I started to try to pull back is there are other levels at which our attention works. And part of this is around time, right? And I'm sure you've had other people on and you've sort of talked about it, like, how do you get your organization to focus on a few core priorities?
Oh, yeah.
Right? How within a project do you not let the project like bubble out in scope, right? And so all of that to me is related to attention. And what I found is that even when I thought I only had a few things to put my attention on, there were still too many things to put my attention on. If I really wanted to learn about what I was thinking about and reading about, if I really wanted to enjoy the process, et cetera, right? So once I decided to say focus on a more limited set of things, and I was going to kind of follow this thread of reading a little bit about neuroscience, then I sort of thought about, right, so this is about going deeper, not broader, right? And so I allowed myself to like read a couple books by the same author, listen to podcasts, interviews with her, right? And really make that what I was thinking about for, several days at a time. And I think for some people, if you're an academic, if you're a researcher, that's probably more natural. But I think for most of us who are in middle and senior leadership roles, the world prioritizes something completely different. And it's not just that we can't multitask in the moment. I don't really think we can multitask very effectively over extended periods of time either. And then that extends to our teams, right? So if I, as a leader, am having a hard time having attention, then it's really hard to get alignment of everybody on my team around the core priorities. And then how many organizations undermine those core priorities by saying, oh yeah, but this thing too, right? So, and I think that, so just to connect it then back to the sabbatical, right? So that is a problem, I think, in most organizations. And I think it is related to why people feel overworked or burned out or just not at the kind of crispness of their cutting edge as they could be, right? Even if they don't have the classical symptoms of burnout, right? It's the mental energy of having to put our attention onto so many things, because the brain does want to process some things. So if you're kind of on the one hand processing something and then getting new input or turning your attention to something else to process, it's inevitably going to exhaust itself, right?
And it's going to exhaust itself. I hear you say, and you also said a little while back, it's not going to produce whatever quality means here, but quality outcomes.
That's right. Right. And those quality outcomes could be measured in a variety of ways.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
It could be the actual work product. It could be the relationships of the people that you're engaged with. It could be the impact of that work. I mean, we're talking about NGOs in particular. And believe me, I think I was able to observe that is true. I'm nowhere near, say, coming up with the magic bullet of how to fix that problem, right? I mean, but I do believe that if we all spent a little bit more time intentionally thinking about that, we might get a little bit more success and a little bit more space.
Yeah. And thankfully, we did not ask you, or would never ask anybody to fix that, right? That would be a huge responsibility. So I'm assuming you did not load that upon your shoulders.
No.
Right. let's transition now as we need to think about the end of the interview to how organizations, how NGOs deal when their leaders need to or want to take a sabbatical, right? And we were talking in this case, 4 months, 3 months, 6 months, whatever, all right? How did Humentum organize that in a way that where it was did justice to what you needed while being fair to everybody else too? Because that's always also a difficult conundrum, no?
Yeah, so I mean, I'm incredibly grateful to the structure we had at Humentum in terms of allowing this as a bit of a benefit. And it's relatively new, so kudos to our CEO, Christine So, who really championed looking at all of our sort of kind of benefits and structuring in some new programs.
Yeah.
And this sabbatical is one that was new to us, and I was happy to take advantage of it. But also grateful for the team, because everybody had to flex to make it work a little bit differently. So, you know, for us, I think what I think I've heard from my team is, well, first of all, what I experienced was a lot of support to try to make this happen.
Wonderful.
And so Christine, who's my direct supervisor, had to take on some new responsibilities. I then distributed some of those responsibilities to other members of my direct reports and some extended team members. You know, and what everyone says is actually true. Like, no one is indispensable, right? So what happens when this happens in an organization is, especially you're talking about a leader in the organization, is, first of all, a lot of what I was doing actually didn't need to get done, right? So some of those things just didn't need to happen, or could happen in a different way, right? So that's part of how the organization absorbs it. Second way the organization absorbs it is, you know, people get great opportunities to rise to meet the challenge and to take on stretch assignments and do different kinds of things, and new relationships have formed. So my team now has a way better relationship with Christine individually, because they all had to spend more time together learning to work with each other, and that benefits the organization totally. The third thing is, you know, some things get reinvented, and that's good too. You know, new processes, you know, get created, or new approaches happen because new voices are in the room kind of talking about those kinds of solutions. So, you know, I think it's why, for example, I mean, what makes me think is, like, you know, I don't know how much NGOs do this, right? But, you know, in the corporate world, sometimes there's this notion of job rotation, right? And they move people around, you know, after a certain period of time. Or if someone's in a high potential category, they want to have them have an opportunity to do HR, marketing. And I think in some ways this is a little bit similar, right? I mean, this is intentional segmenting someone out of the structure, so that you then can rethink about how you're going to do this work. And in the process, there's leadership opportunities for people who are going to get stretch assignments. There's work processes that maybe get reinvented. And then, of course, hopefully your leader comes back and is ready to take on the new challenges.
Yeah, yeah. There's at least 3-4 more questions that I would have loved to ask you, but we don't have that time, ironically. So let me finish on this question before I get to a process question at the end. And the obvious one is, what will you do differently individually after this retreat? What do you hope at a behavior level to maintain or nurture, etc.?
Yeah, there's about 3 or 4 things that I'm doing right now. So the first is, I decided to, you know, we're a completely globally distributed team, but I decided to move my office out of my house. So I'm subletting an office. I walk to work, take 10 minutes at the beginning and the end of the day to do that. And I just go to a physically different space. So in the context of what everyone's talking about in terms of return to work, let's throw that out there. It's what I'm doing, what I discovered I needed. The second is, I am thinking about this issue of attention. You know, I came back and looked at what's the most important thing for me to focus on in coming back in January. I didn't try to worry about a year's plan. I said, what's the most important thing in January? Sat down, wrote a few, you know, bullet points around what that is. Is that 100% of my attention? No, but it's that touchstone that I just kind of keep going back to. Like, this is the most important thing for me to focus on in January. And I talked to Christine about that's what I'm focusing on, right? Third is, we have a Flex Friday program here. I won't get into the details of how it works, but I was a poor user of it before. And I've made that a response, kind of really consciously trying to do that now. I'm going to make that a core thing that I'm doing. It's third thing. Fourth thing, I'm making sure to leave a little bit of space in my time every week to continue to focus on the things that are intellectually interesting to me and that I believe are beneficial to Humentum, but are not just about completing projects, ticking the boxes, et cetera, right? And really saying, look, I need to bring some of that extra energy in, and I believe that it will fundamentally benefit my work and keep the reset going.
Yeah, keep the reset going. Wow, I was so grateful, Chris, for this opportunity to ask you these questions. It's a pretty unique interview. So, if people want to learn more about you, Chris, where should they go?
Yeah, I think the best thing is LinkedIn. I try to be fairly active there, and I've been writing some new stuff on there, just sort of coming back.
I know about the application of Buddhism principles, amongst others, to organizational management.
That was the most recent piece. Yeah, I got a couple other things cooking. So I think LinkedIn, I would love to connect with people on LinkedIn. That's probably the best place. I am on Twitter, but not as active there. And of course, you can reach out to me at Humentum as well. And I'm sure you can put that in the show notes.
Of course. And I will most definitely do that.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much, Chris, for all your insights. This was, as I said, special for me, given the topic and given who you are. Thank you, listeners, also. If you found this podcast interesting and stimulating, as I did, then please be sure to check out the other episodes of my podcast. You can find all of this on my website, 5oaksconsulting.org. That is the number 5 and then OAKSconsulting.org. Subscribe and you'll always be the first to know. And please know that we are now also offering an online course on virtual team leadership skills. Next cohort dates are February 28th till April 8th. And we also offer a free new mini course. So if you think that you need to up your skills when it comes to your virtual teams or your hybrid teams, then there is a place for you to have a look at, and your team will thank you. So this is Tosca, and I look forward to spending time with other interesting leaders like Chris on NGO, Soul, and Strategy next time.